on October 13th, we have a stock dividend that's going to be declared and distributed on the same day. So that's kind of nice. We don't have to deal with the date of declaration, date of record, date of payment, because the date of declaration and the date of payment are all happening at once. So we're just assuming that we understand this by now. So I can go ahead and delete that. But one thing to note is that this 10% common stock dividend is significantly smaller than one of the prior transactions where we had a 3-for-2 split. So this represents 10%. Anything under 25%, you actually do record a change in the paid-in capital, the equity section of the balance sheet. So we do have to maneuver around retained earnings and paid-in capital to some extent. However, intuition or logic would say, well, 10% is going to be how much? 10% of the shares outstanding, and shares outstanding are the 122 minus the 2 million held in treasury, which would be 120 million shares. However, that's not the case, because what happened in the prior transaction C, was we had a 3-for-2 split. So what that meant was we had 120 million shares that were outstanding prior to that split, and that's what I've got here in this T account. We have 120 million that were outstanding prior to the split, but remember the split said, look, for every 2 shares you own, so if I took that 120 and I divided it by 2, for every 2 shares there are, we're going to triple that, and we'll issue 3. So there are now 180 million shares outstanding after that 3-for-2 stock split. So this is the basis from which we start this transaction, 180 million shares that were outstanding. So we're going to now issue 10% more than the 180. However, and so what that would tell us is if we own 10 shares, we get 1. If we own 20 shares, we get 2. But what happens if we own some fraction or some increment of shares less than 10, say 5? If I own 5 shares, do I get half of a share? That doesn't make sense. We don't issue shares in fractional quantities. So in the case of a stock dividend, if I am owed any denomination less than 1, the company will just go ahead and actually write me a check to compensate for that partial share. So this is what this portion of the problem is telling us, is that fractional share rights for 1 million equivalent whole shares were paid in cash. Okay, so let's just dissect this a little bit. We had 180 million shares that we started with before we issued a 10% stock dividend. Yep, okay, so if you take 10% of that, that means there are 18 million new shares that are going to be issued, which is true. However, 1 million of those shares aren't actually issued because they're fractional share rights. So I could actually take 1 away, and the new number of shares that are going to be distributed as a result of this stock dividend are 17 million. So that's the basis from which we construct our journal entry that happens on October 13th. There's kind of a lot going on there, so you might want to just sit back and kind of go back through that a couple of times. But once you understand that, it's fairly straightforward, because we know over and over and over, we've been going over that a dividend is a distribution of retained earnings, and I've kept the prior 2 transactions that affected retained earnings. And I'm just going to add to it now this transaction that's going to reduce retained earnings in the amount of 18 million shares times, and then so what value do we take at the point in which the shares are going to be issued is another question we have to answer, and it's not the par value, it's actually the market value on the date of declaration of the stock dividend. So we take that times the $12, and I know you're probably freaking out that I took 18 million and not 17 million. You'll see why in just a second. So if I take that $18 million times $12 a share, that tells me I'm going to have, I'm going to take out, I think I did that wrong, 18 shares, 18 million shares times 12 bucks would give us, so it would give us something like 216 million. So $216 million is the size that we're going to reduce retained earnings as a result of this stock transaction. However, not all of it is going to be paid in the form of stock. Remember, we're going to pay cash to 1 million fractional share rights. So if I just keep this in notation here, I have 1 million share equivalents times the $12 that the market price is per share. So some of this is going to be distributed in the form of cash. And so we're going to debit retained earnings for 216. We're going to credit cash for 12 million, and the remainder, the 17 million shares that we calculated down here, actually get distributed to the shareholders. And the way we do that is we split it between common stock, and so that's for 17 million shares times the par value, and the par value here is simply $1. So we're going to credit common stock for 17 million, and then the difference goes to paid in capital in excess of par. So the difference here is the 216 minus that. $187,000 gets credited to paid in capital in excess of par. And that's your journal entry for this fairly complicated common stock dividend.